Boker Tov, everybody. So this week's portion, Vayigash, it's a continuation of the Joseph story, and it's sort of a culmination of that story. We see that that his brothers did bring Benjamin back with them, and he gives them food, he treats them well. He continues to test them by hiding a goblet in Benjamin's sack before they go, and accuses him of theft and threatens to throw him in jail. And obviously we see here the brothers do stand up for Benjamin. So we see that they did learn the lesson from all those years ago and how they had treated Joseph. And I think very clearly Joseph needed to see that change in circumstance in order to open himself back up to his brothers after 22 years apart. And they had all learned and grown from their situations. And here we see a really crucial moment because as Joseph reveals himself as their brother, and they became very worried that he should seek revenge or retribution against them for what they had done. And I think they felt that he would be right in doing so. He would have the right to do so, I guess you could say. But that's not what happens here. He forgives his brothers. And he basically says that it was fated, for God brought him there, and he was meant to be there just for this very situation so that he could save their people and all the people of the area from suffering through the famine. So there is an element of fate to this story. And I think it brings up the issue, a puzzling theological question of the idea of fate versus free will. I think here we see there is some sort of underlying fateful aspect to the story that clearly we know what happens after this. We know our people, came and settled in Egypt and eventually became slaves there and eventually were redeemed and came back to the land, a very changed people many hundreds of years later. But there's also, I don't want that to detract from the idea of free will, because Joseph and his brothers is a very complicated relationship and dynamic. And I think it's one we are meant to learn from. We're meant to learn against their example. Here's what not to do, right? Don't, favor a child over the other if you can avoid it. And, and also if you're in a situation of privilege, to not boast and to not, throw that in the faces of those who don't have that privilege, right? So it goes both ways. Joseph and his brothers, they didn't treat each other kindly within their family dynamic. And I think we are supposed to learn from that against that example. So yes, there is an element of fate. It's a setup for our people to have one of the most crucial parts of our people's story, which is that we became a redeemed people, right? We needed to go through this tragedy of slavery together in order to come through the other side, a redeemed people, into our land. And the perspective of that, by the way, I think is really crucial, because again, I think it's the idea of coming into the land and sort of earning it back. Which obviously will come later in the story. But again, that element of fate versus free will, I wanted to bring to your attention here in this very story, because I don't think it would have been easy for Joseph to forgive his brothers at all. And yet he also needed to. He needed to forgive his brothers because in order to reforge that relationship, in order to bring his father back and meet and see his father again after all that time away, and in order for himself to move forward as well. So we see here a miniature redemption within the family dynamic that was made possible through forgiveness.